Hello my quilting friends, my name is Leah Day and welcome back to the Friendship Quilt Along! So this month we are piecing this beautiful Tree of Life block. It's filled with half square triangles and we're going to have a great time piecing and quilting it together. So let's get started working on our arrangement and then piecing all of these beautiful shapes together. So here is our layout for block number 3, our beautiful Tree of Life. And I gotta say, I started to get a little fiddly with this block, arranging and rearranging things. And this is one of the things I really want to caution you against, because as soon as you start doing this, you're gonna start making it even more difficult to settle on, some sort of set pattern. If I start moving one thing, then that's going to throw off something else. And then, here I have two greens next to each other, and now that has to be moved. And you can see how this is just basically a rabbit hole, and it will just continue to spiral and spiral and spiral out of control. So my best piece of advice is put down your blocks, put down your pieces, and then leave them. Don't worry about it. Don't obsess about it. I stepped back from this block and I happened to notice I only had 2 reds show up in the entire block. That's just simply how it ended up happening. It's just how my fabrics ended up going down. I'm not going to worry about it because I think in the overall look of the quilt, once all of the blocks are put together, no one's going to look at this one single Tree of Life block and be like, oh wow, there's only 2 red blocks in there. No one's going to care. It's really easy to get obsessive about this stuff and start fiddling with it, and there's absolutely no point to it. Now, this block is arranged in rows, and you can see how I've set it up. And this is a little different from how I originally designed it. So the very first block that I pieced, I actually did all little squares for the background. All of those were individually pieced squares. Well, when I sat down and started writing the pattern, I realized actually you'll use a little bit less background fabric, and it'll be faster to piece if you do some strips. So you can see here's a strip. There's some strips here. So just as you're arranging your block, make sure to cut out your pieces carefully and then arrange those strips carefully as well. And it is a very simplistic block, but as with all of them, it's really easy to get things flipped around and turned the wrong way. My best piece of advice is to step back from it and shoot a picture of it from above, and then maybe show that to somebody else and make sure that everything is in the right position, because even my brain, I'm ever so slightly dyslexic, my brain will flip something for me. So that might be looking like that, and even when I look at the picture, it looks right, even though it's not. And I have been getting a lot of questions about, when a block doesn't come out perfectly, when seams don't match. My best piece of advice is to just keep on quilting. Don't rip anything. Don't go back and fix it. Don't go back and remake it. Just keep moving forward. I really think that is the best. Okay, so the very first step for our Tree of Life block is to make a whole bunch of half square triangles. And you can find another tutorial on how to make this unit. It's super simple, a lot of fun, and you make 2 half square triangles that match for every set of pieces that you piece together. And so you're going to have, if you want to play with that, then of course you could make your block semi-symmetrical and lay it out that way with that kind of in mind. That would be kind of cool. So if you want to take that on, that would be neat. But as you can see, I just went with a total random arrangement, and I really like how this came out. And you'll need some squares as well. That looks good. And then once you get everything arranged in rows, our next step is to just do our typical thing, and that is to flip over the pieces and clip or pin them together in some way, so that way they hold together nicely. So here I am flipping over, it's a straight flip over and then a clip, straight flip over and then a clip. And that is the method that you want to do, some sort of system, so that way when you get to your sewing machine, you know what seam you're going to stitch, and so that way you don't accidentally get something flipped around the wrong way and accidentally stitch it and, and end up with a half square triangle flipped around improperly. So this is the method that I use. I always clip. I place the clip running perpendicular to the seam I'm going to stitch. And then it's a really easy process of just going all the way down the line, flipping each one over and clipping it in place. So I'm going to do this with all of the rows and then take it to my machine and start stitching the pieces together. And I should also add, we have a bonus giant quilt. It's a 78-inch bonus quilt included with the Tree of Life quilt pattern. And that is pieced the exact same way. The only difference is that our units are supersized. They are 3 times bigger than the single block. And then we also add borders, but basically the same process works even if you're doing a 70-inch quilt, or as you can see, a nice large supersized block too. So I'm going to finish clipping this all together, move over to my machine, and then we're going to begin piecing. So I first begin by stitching through a scrap charger. That's just a doubled up piece of fabric that I stitch through, so that way I get my machine in stitching mode, and if it gags, it's going to happen on that scrap rather than on my pieces. Now let's go over machine settings. I have a regular straight stitch in the center position, and I've dialed my stitch length down to 1.5 millimeters. What that does is just produces a really nice tight stitch. That means I'm able to press my seam allowances open. And that's important because when you have this many seams in a block, it gets really chunky really fast. Okay, so now I take just a second to make sure those pieces are lined up nicely. And I go on ahead and slip those underneath the foot and right up against my needle. That's putting it in jail. So the very next stitch I take is onto those pieces and they don't have the opportunity to slip downward. So stitch all the way down and then grab your next row and line up those pieces. Now one thing I always pay attention to is where I have seam allowance. Here you can see I have that angle going down this way, and I've got some extra bulk caused by that half square triangle. I don't have anything on the other side. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to piece it facing this way, so that way I stitch through that seam allowance first. So I'm going to line this up and make sure the edges of those pieces are in perfect alignment. Just lining up those edges, lining up the corners, and then slip that right underneath the foot. And again, this is just, it's small details, it's really tiny stuff, but by stitching through those seam allowances, that area of bulk first, I'm guaranteeing that the fabrics aren't going to slip down and cause the row to become jagged and no longer accurate. So again, I always just double check, and I've flipped this over so that way I'm beginning with the line of seam allowance. Just make sure to line that up nicely. Whenever I clip my rows together and get those pieces clipped together, I'm never really taking the time to align the pieces or anything like that. That's very temporary. So it's at the machine right before I stitch it that I really take my time and just make sure that the pieces are in nice alignment. All right, so a situation like this, I've got seam allowance on both corners, so it doesn't matter which way this one goes. So just again, line it up nicely, lift the foot slightly, and stitch through it. So I'm just going to continue working my way through all of the pieces, stitching them all into rows, and then we'll meet back here as we begin piecing the rows together. So here are all of my rows pieced together, and I've laid them back out again. And this is another situation where it's really easy to get things flipped around. This is not a symmetrical block, it's on the diagonal. So please double check and refer to your pattern and look to line up these background strips with your pattern, and that's going to help guide you more than anything else, because it can get really confusing, I'll be honest, just looking at it even from above, even from a photo that you've taken. So refer to your pattern and make sure to look at those background strips, and that's going to help you line everything back up again. Okay, so from here all I'm going to do is flip this over, and I know I want to stitch these two together along that seam, so I'm going to place a clip here perpendicular, and I'm just going to do this all the way down the line, clipping all of my rows together in sets of 2, and then I'm going to take them to the machine and start stitching them together. Now one quick note, I did press all of my seam allowances open, and you notice that I'm not pinning this time. This is going to be a block where I'm just going to trust my piecing and fabric preparation and cutting. And what I mean by that is I'm not going to pin a single seam. Instead, I'm going to make sure to line up that starting corner really, really well. Get those fabrics just in absolutely perfect alignment. And I'm going to slide them underneath my foot right up against the needle. I'm going to get started stitching. And then now once I get my needle in it a little bit, now I'm gonna flip up and take a look at that first seam. And I want all of, pretty much all of these seams to match. So I'm just gonna stack that seam on top of the other one. I'm putting nice fingertip pressure straight down, and I'm just gonna stitch right up to my fingers and over that seam. Now I'll do that again. Make sure that that seam allowance isn't flipping over, it's nice and open. Line up those seam allowances and stitch on down. So this is a method that I use a lot when I am sure of my fabric preparation. Like if I have just recently starched my fabric, if I know I cut every single piece accurately and the fabric is stiff and stable, then I know pretty much how it's going to behave, and it should behave consistently all the way down the line. So I don't feel like I need to do a whole lot of penning and fiddling and fussing with it in order to get it to do what I want. It should, theoretically, just slip together nicely. Every once in a while I am noticing I'm getting this top piece is running a little bit short in comparison to the bottom piece. So what I'm going to do is on this one, I'm going to bring those seam allowances down. So it's a little hard for you to see here, just simply because it's already on my machine. But I'm going to bring those seam allowances down so they're stacked just exactly on top of one another and place a pen. So if I notice things are starting to get off slightly, then I will pen at that stage. But this is predominantly how I piece, and I do go fairly fast, even though I'm pressing my seam allowances open. So this is a major criticism of seam allowances pressed open, is that you can't get the locking effect. And here, just let me explain what the locking idea is that if you press your seam allowances to one side, let's say up on this side, and over this way on this other side, then you kind of get almost like a little lock effect. That's the idea from pressing your seams to one side versus pressing them open. The downside of that is, it kind of sometimes works and it sometimes doesn't. It's not necessarily consistent. When you lock seams like that and they don't work out, it ends up being even bulkier than they would have been otherwise. And my thing is, I just like my seam allowances pressed open, so that's why I do it that way. It's not really a right or wrong way, in my opinion. I think both methods are valid and work, certainly. It's just one of those things that I think is good to experiment with and kind of play with it and see which one you like best. So we'll get down to the end and check out our seams and see if they have matched up nicely or not. And this is one of those things I think it's good to experiment with. I don't think that there's a set single way of doing anything. I think it's good to experiment and try new things. And especially if you're feeling like these blocks are taking you a long time to put together, if you're pinning obsessively every single seam, then it might help you to see that, a lot of times I don't pin at all. I just trust my fabric preparation and cutting to do that job for me. All right, so now let's take a look. I'm not going to let myself off the hook here. I'm going to go on ahead and back up the camera just a little bit and show you my seams. So this is where we started up at the top. Looking good, looking good. I think I started to pin at this stage because you can see that seam slipped up ever so slightly. Not too bad though. And then now at this point, for some reason, maybe that half square triangle is just a little bit big. It slipped back down and I have an itsy bitsy tiny pleat right there. Not a big deal. And then I have a perfect match right here and don't need to worry about anything down there. So overall, I'd say 100% successful. Where I'm off ever so slightly, I'm not worried about that. I'm not going to be able to see that from the back of a galloping horse or even 5 feet away. That's a very, very tiny issue. And that's another thing is please don't judge the tiny issues on your quilt that no one else but you would notice. Once we get this basted and quilted, you're not going to see something as tiny as that. It's really not going to be a big deal. And that pleat, not a big deal either. I'm definitely not taking a seam ripper to this. I'm not going to pick anything out. As far as I'm concerned, it's perfect exactly as it is. So I'm just going to continue doing that exact same thing, piecing my rows together, trusting my fingertip pressure, trusting my cutting and my fabric preparation. And I'll cross my fingers and hopefully a lot of my seams will match. So I'm carefully finger pressing these seam allowances open and flat. And there are a lot of half square triangles in this block, so this is going to be just a little bit tricky. I do use a firm pressing board. This is homemade. You can find a tutorial on making one for yourself at leahday.com/press. And I think this is really important. It's good to have a firm pressing board, not just for finger pressing the seams open, but also so you can give a nice solid firm press to your block. And that's going to help flatten out those seams quite a bit. So just take your time on this. Whenever you flip the block over, make sure to use a pressing cloth whenever you go to press, because you've got a lot of raised areas in those seams, and if you hit that with your iron, those raised areas are going to press against the sole plate of your iron a lot harder than other places, and that can cause it to singe. It'll go a little shiny on you. So make sure to use a pressing cloth. That can just be as simple as a leftover fat quarter of fabric, and that just protects the quilt block from the base of your iron. And the last step is to attach your borders. And we have nice wide borders this month. You can do something fun when you go to quilt your borders. And here you can see this is what the block looks like when it's completely done, all pieced together and ready for quilting. So that's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed piecing this beautiful Tree of Life quilt block with me, and I hope you'll give the quilt a try as well. So the quilt pattern for the Tree of Life quilt, which is 78 inches square, you can find that in the same pattern as you get your block, and that's going to be at leahday.com/friendship. And I'm going to be sharing a tutorial on how to quilt this block on my home machine, how to quilt it on my long arm, and how to quilt the quilt version on my long arm as well. So I hope that you're looking forward to all of these tutorials coming up in the month of February. Join in the fun of the Friendship Quilt Along anytime and work at your own pace. All of these blocks are designed to use charm packs. So you can use up your charm pack stash or your scrap stash and make a variety of beautiful blocks. And the best thing is this pattern is sized, so you can make a crib, throw, twin, king, or queen, whatever size you're needing to make, you just simply make more blocks. So I hope that you'll come and learn more at leahday.com/friendship. Until next time, let's go quilt.